Hello, everybody. Today, I have the pleasure and honor of speaking with Dr. Marc Applebaum. Dr. Applebaum received his PhD in psychology from Saybrook University in 2009 with the supervision of Amadio Giorgi. He is currently a member of the psychology faculty at Saybrook Graduate School. He teaches qualitative research methods, and more specifically, descriptive phenomenological research informed by the works of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Paul Ricoeur. His own research is concerned with topics in cultural, organizational, and religious psychology. And he's been on the editorial boards of the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology and the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Today, I want to ask him a little about his personal journey in phenomenological psychology, his education, his background, his viewpoints, and we also want to provide, hopefully, a few entry points for our viewers who are less familiar with phenomenology and its place in psychology, especially, and whatever else we end up talking about. So let me begin with thanking you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Marc.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Shall we begin with a little bit of background, your entry into phenomenology, the first encounter, what was happening before?
Yeah, I first, first, thanks for the opportunity.
My pleasure.
And so entering phenomenology, I think this happened really at a time when I had been immersed in kind of working psychologically myself and exploring different, more experiential ways to explore psychology as a field, like psychosynthesis, Gestalt work, movement and art therapy. This was like a personal exploration on the way to looking at, do I want to return to school? I wasn't in grad school yet at that time for psychology. My background was really a very broad liberal arts background, history of culture, that kind of thing. And I found my way back into, a psychological interest, first by working with people in community mental health as a counselor in San Francisco. So I spent about 8 years in that work, working with recently homeless adults. And it was during that time that I was looking at, do I want to pursue a psychology degree? And a very close friend and mentor of mine who had done his PhD with Giorgi suggested that I pick up the book Psychology as a Human Science. That's Giorgi's really landmark 1970 book, which offers a vision of, really an alternative vision of psychology along qualitative and phenomenological lines. So my friend said, well, read the book, see what you think. And if that speaks to you, if this approach speaks to you, then, contact Giorgi and sit down and talk to him. And that would be a way of exploring whether to get into a degree program. Because at that time, Giorgi was acting dean at Saybrook University in San Francisco. So that was my entry. That was it. After reading the book, because immediately when I got into psychology as a human science, it just spoke to me in a very immediate way, because it was a way into the kind of the texture of life, of living, and a way to engage with people's experience. Remember, this is at a time when I'm working with people hands-on, who are in the midst of depression, different diagnoses around psychotic disorders and that kind of thing, drug addiction. It was that conversation with Giorgi in his office at Saybrook that kind of convinced me this is what I wanted to do. And so I ended up doing my master's and PhD with him in phenomenology.
Your story is quite unique, because for the typical student, usually we share, as students, when we are students of psychology, we share that interest in common. The source of the interest is it's a personal place. We want to understand ourselves and the people around us. Mm-hmm. And then for the typical student, I think the experience is, after a few semesters, they realize that what they're studying doesn't necessarily have a lot of relevance for understanding themselves and understanding persons, as opposed to in terms of categories that try to be objective, try to be measurable, quantitative, and scientific in the sense of other sciences, physical sciences. But you already had that background of doing work, counseling work. So you didn't have to go through that process of...
Well, yeah, yes and no, though. I mean, this is an excellent point, because I was working with people, and that was a great kind of trial by error exposure, but I didn't have any clinical training formal. And I was sort of on the job. This was a very sort of nonprofit community mental health sort of setting. And so I hadn't gone through like a clinical program where I had sort of absorbed the DSM as my primary lens for looking at people. For example, the diagnostic and statistical manual for diagnosing was something that I just began to encounter along the way in working with people in that way. And so in a sense, I was lucky because I got to sort of learn in a maybe less methodical way about that particular lens, but I was encountering people themselves at the same time. And what didn't sit right to me was, for example, what was typical in the system at that time, and this is going back, some years, but so this may have changed, but what was typical was guidance within the community mental health system of stuff like, for example, you'd have a training and a psychiatrist would tell you, well, never validate the delusion of a quote unquote psychotic patient, right, client. And I kind of understood the point, I thought at the time, but on the other hand, something didn't fit with me because it was as if we were supposed to be just regrounding people in a consensus reality that they weren't experiencing very well themselves, and sort of somehow sidelining what it is that they were experiencing. See, and often just talking about. So, I mean, I was lucky to work in a program eventually for years where I had long-term clients. So I'd be meeting with the same people who lived in households together over the course of years. So there was a chance to really have a relationship. And I had clients who would describe to me, like, my neighbor visits me through the walls and, is abusing me verbally. And I mean, really, which would be normally just the guidance I was getting was, well, almost as if don't pay attention to what it is they're experiencing, and just get them back on, like, are you taking your medication? This kind of thing. Are you sleeping? Which is a good question, by the way. I know I may be drifting a bit, but I think what I'm trying to give you a sense of is the gap that started to open up for me between the way that system I was working in wanted me to look at and relate to people, and what felt like what was missing. And that's where phenomenology really opened up for me. And I'll say one more thing about that, which is that once I started not only to read Georgie's book, but then actually to study phenomenology once I entered school, I think that what that tradition gave me initially, which was wonderful for me, was an ability to really listen to people and be curious about what they were experiencing without having to adopt immediately a position in relation to them about, yes, that's really happening. No, that's not really happening. And this goes to something else we might talk about the natural attitude, but in phenomenological terms, the natural attitude that things are the way they seem. The natural attitude of everyday life, Husserl called it, or the natural theoretical attitude, but I don't want to start lecturing, so let me go back to you.
It's also the common ground, the easiest, most easily agreed upon with other people. There's a way of viewing reality that is almost guaranteed that we can agree upon it with other people when we talk about how things are. That's the way I think about natural attitudes. It's and there are other experiences, like other deep experiences that are on the margins of that, and then when we are at the center, we are encouraged to not recognize what is at the margin because we are supposed to protect the stability of the center.
Yeah, no, there's a very great deal there, and I'm with you about the attitude that most people would agree to. I think that's a very deep topic. We could spend a whole day just talking about the natural attitude, because there's also a sense in which that attitude of everyday life, there's many layers to it, is one in which people are sort of taught they ought to agree to it as well.
Right.
It depends on what dimension of natural attitude we're talking about. But again, that could take us into everything from politics to religion to materialist kind of view of life. There's a lot packed into that.
Sure.
But I think that just to take a step back, that I think what phenomenology gave me was the ability to recognize the interpretations that we're already living in relationship to our world and each other. without
And,
saying yes or no to those, but just to start to recognize them.
right, right, right.
Yeah.
That there is an already existing and operating interpretive apparatus, if you call it that, that is at play. Right.
Absolutely, and that's such a valuable insight, I think, for us as students when we're students, or but also because those assumptions, those interpretations are both happening on the personal level and they're happening on the collective level. There's a collective way of, which might be a whole nation, or it might be a community of people, or it might be a subcultural sort of, but shared interpretations of the world. So those start to stand out much more as that. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'll go back to my own experience in 2014 when I was getting close to my PhD defense. I found Georgie's work, and some of the most memorable and most impactful articles that I read by him, two that I remember the most. One is a book chapter in which he remembers his own journey, his own struggles as a marginal psychologist.
Right.
Another one is, I think, in celebration, marking maybe 50 years of being an editor for Phenomenological Psychology journal. Again, historical reflections on, because he had a very significant role in creating a movement. And then after reading those, I found your work. So that was also in around 2014. And you have one of your articles is titled Phenomenological Psychology Research as Science. So you contributed to to thinking clearly about at least my own thinking about the status of phenomenological psychology, not as something that is moving in the direction of relativism and anything goes. And at the same time, it's not science in the ordinary sense that we identify that. So maybe we can talk a little bit. I'd love to hear your reflections on this scientific status of it's an approach to psychology that we can talk about as scientific and what that means.
Wow, yeah, thank you. I think that a big struggle of mine, just personally, and I think this has a lot to do with how I found my way into kind of the mix of psychology and philosophy that sort of occupies me, is on the one hand looking for a methodical way of inquiry. And by methodical, I mean a path of inquiry that's not just simply idiosyncratic, but is shared. So looking for a path of inquiry for reliable understanding, not complete or perfect understanding, but reliable understanding of, let's say, within psychology on the one hand, but without becoming locked into a narrow interpretive framework that sort of predetermines what I'm going to see so tightly that there's no room for discovery. You know, in other words, I'm just given a bunch of buckets into which to sort whatever shows up in the other person or in my own experience. So,
or we can say, sorry to interrupt, but we can say that if we overdetermine the method, we are already deciding what it is that we are doing about the subject matter, regardless of what the subject matter is. So that's a very strict way of dealing with the method.
Right, and this isn't to say that an interpretive lens, like I don't want to sound as if I'm criticizing any number of psychological methods, or whether clinical or otherwise. Like, just to take an example of psychoanalysis, I mean, I find Freud just my own relationship with Freud is one of just such appreciation, or Freud, Jung, for example. So just geniuses. So I'm very appreciative of theory. It's more that I think the issue, and I think Husserl was brilliant on this, is when the theoretical lens becomes mistaken for reality as such, for the given as such, let's say, even. And then we fall into a kind of naivete. And I think a lot of the book, The Crisis of the European Sciences, is precisely about this, the way the sciences tend to kind of forget that they're at their best a kind of an explorative construction that is working on the foundation of the lived world, and confuse their theoretical grasp with the world itself. So, and I think that just, again, this is the sort of very personal side of this for me, but But the issue of relativism, or the challenge of relativism, are there only just interpretations, or is there an intersubjective real there to be interpreted? Was something that kind of tormented me, I have to say, since a very young age. So that's, in a sense, what led me into this kind of effort to find an approach or approaches to rigorous understanding, scientific path of understanding, that was neither sort of so saturated by kind of postmodernism, and I think a bad version of postmodernism, by the way. I appreciate the postmodern philosophers quite a lot as well, but a bad version of postmodernism that left students, because I was a student at this time, sort of at sea with just a kaleidoscope of all relative interpretive viewpoints, which I didn't find helpful at all, or useful, or that reality-based, or something that was just rigidly formal, on the other hand, theoretically speaking. So that was a mouthful.
No. Yeah, I'm thinking that somebody who might be listening to us, some people might be a little confused because we are still not directly saying what it is that we are talking about and why it is special. I mean,
yeah, we haven't said what phenomenology has been trying to do yet, actually.
Yeah. So there's, again, I'll go back to that experience of, being among other graduate students, and we had apparently very comfortable setting. We had a scientific method. We were studying visual attention. Some of my friends and colleagues were studying visual memory, and they had these paradigms. But if you really sit with it, if you meditate on it, it really had nothing to do with being a person. That's why that's the source of my longing and my search for something like a phenomenological method. Started there. It started with, like, people were really busy and they were achieving things. We were publishing papers, but it didn't mean that thing that psychology was supposed to mean. So yeah.
Let me come back. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So let me come back to the example of working with clients in the mental health system.
Sure.
There's one experience there that I'll share with you that said so much to me at the time, which is, so I'm working with a woman, I'm meeting with her every week, who's been homeless before, has had a lot of upheaval in her life, but is now sort of living in an apartment in the community, but still, and seeing a psychiatrist, taking various psychoactive medications to help maintain a kind of stable living situation. With all of that, she still she experiences on a fairly regular basis, like what would typically be called visual and auditory hallucinations. So she's describing to me, like I mentioned earlier, the neighbor floating through the walls and abusing her verbally, which is obviously like really upsetting, kind of frightening, right? And I think that so how to relate to that experience, right? I'm sitting there like, I'm there to help. So what am I supposed to do with that? Am I supposed to just, am I supposed to just say, well, maybe you need to talk to your psychiatrist about raising your medications? And by the way, that might not be a bad idea. I'm not a psychiatrist. So, I mean, she should be talking to that person, but it's me here now, right? So what do I do with this? And I think that, so for anybody who is now, who might be listening to this, who's never heard a word about phenomenology in the first place, and it's just a mystery, one thing that a phenomenological approach does is it says, let's start by setting aside the question of whether the experience that's being described to you is factually real or not, factually, like empirically real. Let's set that aside in order to ask, what does it mean to the person? The experience that she's having right now, what does it mean to her? What's her experience? What's that like for her? And so I was just familiar enough at that moment with that tradition to be able to sort of set aside the kind of informal training I'd received about don't validate the delusion, which didn't feel quite right. So I set that aside. And I didn't validate it. I didn't say, yes, your neighbor really is floating through the wall. What do we do about that? Because that would imply a whole different, like, I don't know what that would imply. But instead, I just started listening. Like, what is she grappling with? Because she was grappling with something. She wasn't just reporting something that she was completely helpless in, I started to understand how she was in her own way trying to cope with what she was experiencing.
Mhm.
Partly in ways that were helpful and partly in ways that weren't helpful. So part of what she would do when this got really painful for her was start drinking a can of beer, go down to the corner and buy some alcohol.
Mhm.
And again, like the system would be telling me, oh, no, that's bad. That's going to interfere with the medication or whatever it is, right? Which again, there's reality to that. I'm not dismissing that. But adopting a phenomenological attitude enabled me to at least relate to her. This is empathy, right? I mean, the key word here is empathy. To at least relate to her world enough to kind of get, okay, I get why she's drinking, because that is shifting her experience enough to make it more bearable.
Mm-hmm.
See, it was a strategy, in other words. It wasn't just like acting out or some bad behavior, or again, this was the sort of naive way that I think the system was sometimes pushing us to view these things like I'm supposed to wag my finger and say no, no, no. But I think what phenomenology gave me a way into was how to have a conversation with her about what she's experiencing, what strategies she's using to cope with it, in a way that did not just come across as, because this was a very bright woman. That's the other thing that I guess I want to say. As soon as I was able to drop my own assumptions enough to realize how she was strategically responding to what was going on, then I was able to kind of have a conversation with her about, well, how does that work out? Like when you drink, does things actually get better? And that's a whole different conversation, because I'm not denying that she's having this whole experience with the neighbor. I'm not trying to fight her on that. I'm neither validating nor invalidating it, because I'm bracketing the reality of that issue. Mm-hmm. But that enables us to have a conversation about what's working for you now as you deal with this, which then freed her up to say, well, it does kind of help at the beginning, but then actually things get worse when I'm drinking after a while. See, so all of a sudden we're in a conversation about what her life is like. And then I'm with another human being, and there's something that I can help with in some way, hopefully. But more than anything, there's two people talking now. So the asymmetry is not absolutely gone. Otherwise, it's not gone. But now we're relating as two people. So it's more of to bring, I can't avoid bringing Marc and Buber in a little bit at least, which is like, then there's more of an I-thou. I'm really relating to another person as a you, not as just a patient. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's what I was looking for in the first place. So
right. Yeah. I like to emphasize once again, there are the two features in that process of entering into a relationship. So this is, I think we can describe this as an aspect of the method, a phenomenological method that requires a different kind of relating to the other person. And I think many people, anybody in the world, almost anybody in the world who has taken a Psych 101 course or Psych 100, depending on the university, have this experience of going to a lab to fulfill some course credits, do some experimental research, be a subject or a participant in research. So we remember that kind of what relationship that is, what kind of relationship that is. It's a relationship with some kind of authority figure who knows more about what is going on, who will instruct us, who will instruct me, the ignorant participant. And actually the word that we use is that the participant is naive, and that's good. Only use naive participants and keep them naive. We can do some debriefing at the end. Yeah. So that's a very asymmetrical relationship, and that is one of the things that changes. But without you introducing that alternative way of relating to a human being, this asymmetry might go invisible. So we might not notice that there are other options other than this asymmetric relationship. So that part was great. The other part that is, go ahead.
Just to say, for folks listening, the asymmetry in what I didn't say, which I think you're bringing in as well, is implicitly, is the objectifying attitude toward the other person, that they're just the object of science, or something or whether it's clinical science or research. And we're trying to sort of deconstruct that a bit, drop that, because it's so distancing. And anyhow, that was my footnote, but please.
Right. No, great. The other part is in the hard science psychology, or the psychology that tries to be a hard science. It is usually determined in advance what would count as success, and by contrast, what would count as failure. But in this scenario that you described, it is open-ended. We don't know. Once we enter into that relationship, it depends to a large degree on her, and on what is discovered in the process of co-discovery. But in an
Yeah.
experiment, there's a hypothesis, and the hypothesis can be
Right.
verified or falsified or something like that.
Right.
So that open-endedness is also very, it's a feature that I can imagine it might scare some people. It might confuse some students, like what to do with that.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do? So I'll just passively observe and take record of what is going on.
Oh yeah, then this is a whole series of great questions and what and observations in what you just said. I think, let me just say one thing as well for folks listening, because just to be explicit, like we're sort of tacking back and forth between the experimental or the research side of psychology and the clinical.
Mm-hmm.
And the method that I was studying at that time was not clinical. Like the descriptive method in psychology that Georgi pioneered is not a method of working clinically with people. And at least that's not its intention. That's not what it's designed for. It's strictly for research. But I was being introduced to a much broader phenomenological tradition in the works with him and then in my own reading. And then since, so, and I was working, of course, with people at the time. So just in case there's any confusion, like when we're talking about descriptive phenomenological research, that's one particular approach within this big tradition called phenomenology. In which there's also a very rich tradition of phenomenological clinical psychology and psychiatry. And I say that simply because this week I've been reading some of Eugene Gendland and Prouty's work around working with people experiencing schizophrenia, and they also very much immersed in phenomenology, but from the clinical side. Mm-hmm. There's a lot. So, and this goes way back. I won't get into footnotes on that tradition, but I wanted to just acknowledge that. So coming back, could you come back to your last point?
I was comparing the features of a phenomenological method with the feature of a scientist as authority and the striving towards objectivity.
Yeah, and hypothesis-driven research, some other discovery-oriented research. And I think this is a great distinction. And I think, again, something I'm really grateful to Georgi for in his writing, and is really clarifying, drawing on a distinction in the tradition, which is that between sort of hypothesis-driven science and science that's taking place in the context of discovery rather than validating hypothesis. So, and I think that, how to put this really succinctly, like when I'm working with students now who are thinking about it, studying phenomenological psychology as a research method, a big, everyone comes in with some burning issue that they want to research, right? And along with that burning issue is a bunch of ideas, intuitions, thoughts about it, personal experiences about that. And so my job as a teacher is not to invalidate any of that, but to add, but hopefully to help them add to it a kind of enough witnessing of all of what they're bringing themselves, let's say, recognition of what they're bringing along, to be able to then clear the space, to be curious about what is the thing itself, what is the, like, for example, if I have a student who's experiencing, who wants to research, an experience of recovery from depression, for example. So I had a dissertation that was on that topic, a student dissertation that was on that topic. Faith in relation to the recovery from depression, right? So everything that student brings along with that, either what they've observed or what they've experienced themselves, is valuable, but as possibly relevant to what the other person or people who they interview will have experienced themselves. So this is the way that this is coming back to your point, is I'm hoping to help the student to adopt an attitude of really open curiosity and availability to seeing and hearing what the other is experiencing, to following the experience of the other in my colleague Magnus Englander's great expression about the role of empathy and phenomenological research. Follow the experience of the other person. So that requires taking stock of what what I'm bringing to the table and setting it aside enough to be able to really now follow what is the other person experiencing. And then phenomenology. So first of all, really get what's the texture and the quality and the meaning of that, of the experience for them, for the other person as best I can. And then as I'm interviewing a number of people and working with those transcripts, looking for, are there essential commonalities or relative invariances structurally between these experiences. This is sort of in the direction of looking for an underlying psychological structure, if there is one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Features that persist across the experience of different people or different episodes of the same kind of.
That stand out to us as we stay with the data, which is the experiences as they're given to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a naive question. So this in introductory texts in psychology, maybe introductory texts about methods, research methods, we might read a lot of times, I think it's a frequent expression that the highest goal and the highest measure of success of a science is prediction and control. And a distinction that was historically made between, on the one hand, prediction and control, and treating our objects of study as machines or objects, collection of objects, and on the other hand, understanding. Is it useful to pause a little bit on this theme, on this distinction? Because a student might ask you, yeah, I've done research on recovery from depression, but I still cannot predict what happens in the case of one particular individual. Is that a problem to not be able to predict, or if it's not a problem, why it's not a problem?
Yeah, I mean, if science is something like this, I'm going to try to go up to 30,000 feet and then come back down again.
Sure.
It's such a big question, right? So you're really asking a question about the nature of science, I think, in a sense. The nature and aims of science.
Right.
And I say aims plural because there should be room for the predictive interest and for the meaning interest, to be kind of like rough about the distinction. I mean, there's plenty of cases, even staying with the depression example like you did, where we really want to be able to, science generally speaking, broadly speaking, would really want to be able to make some kinds of predictions. I don't know. I mean, maybe an obvious example is if we were trying to treat depression, we're trying to treat the diagnosis of major depression with some regimen of that combines exercise and medication or something like that. I'm just making this up off the top of my head, right? But we would want, science would have a lot at stake in understanding, like, is there a correlation between increased exercise and a sense of well-being that helps resolve the depression, or at least contain it better, manage it better. Same with any particular type of medication. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why we'd want to be able to predict. Again, I'm speaking of science like super broadly right now. Now, if I adopt a sort of more of a like qualitative perspective, that interest might have more to do with, well, what's the depression like in the first place? And is there only one? Is depression? Does that refer to one experience, or are there a range of experiences that we're sort of in a maybe inexact way using the same word for? So in other words, we suspend the diagnostic term as necessarily identical with one kind of experience, and then we ask the question of people, in relation to real people, like, what are you describing as depressed, feeling depressed, or being deeply depressed? I'm kind of feeling my way into this question with you right now.
No, that's great. That's great. So without getting to the meaning, we wouldn't even know what it is that we are trying to predict or control. I mean, the first step should be understanding what it is that is present to us.
Yeah, what's the situation for the person?
Right.
Exactly. From their perspective,
right.
From their perspective. And not their sort of self-conscious analysis of it. We're not asking for that. This is where the word naive that you mentioned before is actually really useful. If what we mean by naive is just tell me what it's like for you, which is the sort of paradigmatic qualitative question, like, it's about the qualia. What is it like? Like, what are you going through? What are you experiencing? Well, waking up in the morning is the hardest part of the day. I cannot get out of bed. I don't want to get out of bed. Whatever it is, Then we start to get the feeling of what's the world of that person now, right? And I think that provides the context for everything that you were also talking about. Anything we would want to be able to predict about, or any of that, is going to be meaningful again for the depressed person within the context of their life. So that's how we come back to that side of the equation.
Mm-hmm. I have another naive question based on my observation. This is something that I started observing. I soon realized a major difference between my side, my original side, where I got my training in psychology, and then the phenomenological side. I realized that what phenomenological psychologists do, and philosophers in general, and it's a little bit difficult at first to understand for somebody coming from that science side of the science, the hard sciences, is going back to the old texts. So this is almost like a practice of reading Husserl, reading the logical investigations, as opposed to reading the most recent articles on a topic. Like somebody is interested in memory, they go to the most recent publications on neuroscience and memory, or experimental psychology on memory.
Yeah.
What is it that motivates a person, a scholar, to go back in time and recollect these texts, old texts, and not just reading them once for information, but to return to them again and again? So it seems like almost a very different lifestyle. And then after that, maybe we can also mention in particular some texts.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah, happy to. I mean, in a way, it's almost like asking, well, why would anybody read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca?
Right.
That's a kind of an old book, isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
yeah.
Is there something about the human condition that is profoundly reflected in a great book?
Maybe Marcus Aurelius in our current time is not a good example, because it's associated a lot with self-help and like people wanting to be confident and have control over their habits. Well, so that's the justification that some people might get.
I know I get what you're referring to. There's a kind of a marketing of Stoicism these days.
Right.
I think a bit tacky, or there's naivete right there. Is kind of trying to instrumentalize a classic. I mean, I don't want to be too condescending about that, because if somebody's encountering something that Marcus Aurelius wrote and is inspired by it and sees their own life differently, then that's it right there. I mean, then they're in dialogue with him, as far as I'm concerned. And how deep that goes is up to that person, right?
So are you suggesting that it's for its own sake? Are you suggesting that it shouldn't be instrumentalized? And I hear that you're kind of challenging my question, that I shouldn't ask why we are returning to old texts. Is that right?
Oh, no, I'm trying to respond to it. Yeah,
okay.
I'm trying to respond to it. Yeah. No, it's a perfectly good question, because I think there's this attitude, even in, some of the courses I'm teaching currently, when we're asking students to do literature reviews, they're asked to find their citation should be in articles published within the last 5 to 7 years or something like that. It's just a guideline, right, for the exercise. And part of me kind of goes, yeah, okay, I get that. Like current research, you want to know what the state of the field is in a given topic. Makes complete sense to me, right? But on the other hand, like I've rarely read anything in psychology that grabs me the way that William James does. Georgie might say the same thing, because that was a huge influence on him, as he's written about, right? Is the principles of James's principles of psychology. So it's kind of both. It's sort of both and, rather than, but I think there is a naive assumption, and I frankly think this comes along with being in a consumerist society, that whatever brand is newest and hottest is the best. You know what I mean? So, and that has nothing to do with deep understanding, right? At all. Yeah. That's more about what's flashy and superficially relevant, but maybe not deeply insightful. So, okay, let me take a step back. I don't want to get on a high horse about that issue, but I think that the reason to go back to the reason to read is, aren't we reading anything for the level of insight that it gives us about that topic? So in that sense, that's what I found about Husserl. I think that personally, so shall we go to that piece now? Like what books? Yeah. So I mean, in other words, it's not so much about. I didn't have a program myself about trying to exhaustively understand the whole arc of Husserl's career as a philosopher. Number one, I mean, any actual phenomenological philosopher would tell you that's a lifetime's work right there. Anyhow. And I was not seeking to become a professional philosopher anyway, and I wasn't in a philosophy program. But rather, I was looking for, in the same way that I did when I read Buber, for example, when I encounter this other person through their words, does the world open up in a different way or in a new way for me that is intrinsically valuable? And so having read, like, again, just my own bio, like having read Psychology as a Human Science, I had the conversation with Georgie about, okay, well, so, you know, this is a big tradition, like, what should I read? You know, I'm interested because I got from that book the general perspective, and I felt some real excitement about that. So I asked, so what would you recommend I start with reading? And it's funny, these are sort of, sometimes you remember important conversation moments in your life very distinctly, and I could tell you exactly where I was sitting when we had this conversation, you know, in Sonoma. But yeah, the two books he recommended were The Crisis of European Sciences of Husserl, which I mentioned, and The Phenomenology of Perception of Merleau-Ponty. And not only that, but again, just to sort of frame the way in which I was kind of invited to encounter those texts was not in a kind of, not as information that I was trying to absorb in a kind of a exhaustive way, if you know what I mean, right?
Sure.
Which I think is often the way that we're taught, is we're trying to sort of as quickly and efficiently as possible absorb the information contained in this book, right? And that was not at all the way that wasn't the invitation at all. It was more like, and I'm really thankful for this because I pretty much still had that assumption going myself. So I actually thought, and said to him, okay, well, so what I'm thinking I'll do is, like, I'll read The Crisis, Husserl's book, and I will sort of create a little lexicon for myself as I read, like, what are the key terms in this book and how are they defined? Now, that's not a bad exercise, by the way, so I don't want to be too dismissive of that. But he said, well, he sort of said, well, just read the book, you know, like, you know, you don't have to sort of force yourself to read cover to cover, like straight through in some way. Read the book, see what comes to you as you read it, pick it up, put it down, you know, just, again, relate to what's going on in these books. Phenomenology, Perception, Crisis of the European Sciences. And so what he was describing was encountering the other person as a thinker through their book and the world and the view of the world that they were describing. And that really freed me up tremendously. And to relate to what was going on in the book, not just to try to sort of quickly analyze and absorb it. In other words, to be kind of in a dialogue with the book, really.
Right. That's great. As I was listening to you, I was reminded of an analogy, a comparison with Plato. I mean, people read Plato's dialogues. And one of the reasons, one possible reason, is to encounter again and again the Socratic method. And the best way to get the Socratic method is to just read through. And, you know, we are not done with Socrates or Plato. We don't finish reading the book. But the encounter can continue, just like a friendship. The work doesn't exhaust itself because we can allow the sentiment, like Husserl's method, just like the Socratic method or Merleau-Ponty's method, can allow for it to resonate in our activities, in our inquiries.
Right. And again, not because one, again, for, not because one must subscribe to the point of view of the text or the author, but just to dwell with it long enough to get a sense for how is Merleau-Ponty looking at the world.
Right, right.
And I think that was the brilliance, especially in that book, because when you read Phenomenology of Perception, he is constantly going back and forth between more sort of classical empirical science and psychological science, and looking at perception and attention and all of these issues that seem to be already pretty well understood in some respects by empirical psychology. And so he'll dig deeply into those ideas and what happens when you look at the world through the lens of those theories. And then he'll sort of quickly step to the side and say, well, how about this? And he'll give an entirely different account. He'll switch perspectives. And it's difficult to follow him, I think, often in those. I mean, I was reading the beginning of that book with some students recently, and it was disorienting for them because it was like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on,
It's kind of like simultaneously discourse and meta discourse are happening at the same time, and it's showing that what is involved in a way of characterizing the body or perception.
And that friction is actually, I think, essential to any learning experience that's really going to go deeply. So there's friction, there's frustration, there's confusion, there's disorientation. And by the way, that's something that I do tell every class, like when I'm teaching phenomenological research, I will always remind students that they're encountering a very different way of looking at the world and relating to other people's experience. Most likely it's going to be radically new for them. And if there's not some at least period of sort of disorientation, confusion, then they're not really engaged yet. So that's part, but that's never the case, because that's already going on. By the time I'm speaking to this issue, people are already like, I'm not sure I get this, like what's being said here. This is sort of, I never thought about, like, what does this mean? That's good, because that's sort of the sort of, then there's something happening. That's also the challenging of one's own naive assumptions before you even know they are being challenged. It's like, there's the experience of what, like,
something is not right. That experience of
I just don't get it. Something's different. Like, what is this man or woman, whoever the author is? What are they talking about? Like, I don't get it. I thought I knew what this book was about. Something like that.
Yeah. I know the kind of thing that people usually do as authors of books, but this is something else. This is doing another kind of thing. I thought maybe we could also mention Scott Churchill's book, recently published book, and it's still actually not available. I haven't had a chance to read it on Kindle. It is to be released soon.
Right, it's coming out shortly.
And
you can order it now. This is my ad campaign, but I'm so excited about this book. So it's available. I'll say a few things, and then, but just for people, it is available now to be ordered because it's come. The APA, the American Psychological Association, is publishing it shortly. It's about to be released, and I was so excited to. So what would you like me to speak to? Because there's a lot I could say about the book.
It's an introduction to, I think the title is Existential Phenomenological Research.
Right.
And maybe a few things about why it would be a useful, important book for students who are maybe encountering this for the first time.
To me, this book plus phenomena plus psychology as a human science almost belong together. I mean, I think because there's been a lot of good scholarship on phenomenological psychology, but I think what Scott's doing, and I was really fortunate to be able to read the galley of the book from cover to cover, and that was just super exciting to me, because what he's done is to sort of represent, again, with students in mind, it's really important, a picture of the whole approach, the whole sort of approach that largely came out of the Duquesne tradition in phenomenological research, as from its theory of science to its sort of perspective on interviewing and data analysis and the whole epistemology underlying phenomenology. And it's got enough of the epistemology, enough of the philosophy in it, to really clarify, like, where are we coming from? Like how did we get to this approach? What's the basis of it?
Mm-hmm.
But then his examples in this book on every level, in terms of formulating a research question, going through the interview process, gathering data, working with data. What's the process of working with data like? It's very rare that one sees that really described richly as a student, to really get, like, from someone who's deeply experienced in that work, in data analysis. What's that process like? What should I expect? Really helpful. Again, when we think about method, the word method, here goes with etymology, but the word method comes from the word for path in Greek, the English word method. I mean, it comes from the word for path. And I really love that, because we're looking for a path that is a well-trodden path that can be shared. And that's what Scott's giving students in this book. I want to say that's sort of where I'm going with that. Is it really gives you enough guidance and examples, concrete examples of studies that were done by his students in Dallas. So what they went through in terms of conducting the study, what their findings looked like. So I think that, and it's very inclusive of the tradition as a whole, which is excellent. So
that's great. I would also, I haven't read, obviously I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited about it, and I would recommend people joining me and reading together at the same time and discussing it potentially. I have some more questions for you, and it's totally fine. This was our first conversation. We were a little bit disorganized, but it was a lively conversation from my perspective, at least. It was lively, even though it was maybe, and I'm a little bit apologetic to our to our viewers now, but I think we can continue with this with the hope of maybe being a little bit more systematic in the future next time, because I have more questions, and I think we have opened up a lot of paths of inquiry, things that you touched already. For example, the critique of consumerism. Like, why is it that some approach to psychology can be critical in general, not just of psychological methods, but generate a critical stance of culture in general?
Right.
And why is it that, by contrast, other scientific methods end up being very compatible with the status quo of the currently dominant culture?
Yeah, absolutely.
We can explore these. I'm also interested in learning more about the relationship with, in addition to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, your relationship with Paul Ricoeur.
Yeah. Extremely important for me.
Yeah. So perhaps, because we have reached the hour mark now, so I shouldn't take too much more of your time. Maybe we can leave some of those topics for future conversation.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And until next time. Let me